Have you ever noticed someone telling a story, maybe just explaining why they chose the blue mug instead of the red one, and suddenly you're halfway through their entire family history, a brief lecture on coffee culture, and a side tangent about their cat's emotional needs? You think, wow, they really could have just said, I liked this mug. And yet, here they are, elaborating, detailing, justifying, almost like they're afraid you won't understand unless you have the entire context of the universe. If that sounds familiar, maybe you've been that person yourself. Or maybe you're silently observing someone who can turn a simple, I went to the store, into a 10-minute exploration of economic trends, aisle layouts, and why cheese tastes better in autumn. At first glance, this habit seems harmless. Maybe it's even a little funny. But if you dig deeper, psychology suggests there's a fascinating mechanism behind the urge to over-explain. And trust me, it has nothing to do with simple indecision or a love of hearing your own voice. Well, maybe a little, but it goes much deeper than that. Let's start by considering why we even explain things in the first place. Humans are natural sense makers. Our brains are wired to predict, interpret, and organize information so that the world feels understandable. We don't like uncertainty. It feels like a tiny threat to our nervous system. And one of the ways we cope with that is by creating stories, frameworks, and explanations. Even in a casual conversation, our minds are quietly thinking, I need to make this comprehensible. I need to be understood. For people who over-explain, that internal engine is simply turned up to 11. There's a heightened awareness of how others might perceive them, paired with a strong desire to prevent misunderstandings. It's not just about communication, it's about control, in a very subtle cognitive sense. When someone over-explains, they're essentially saying, I want you to see the whole picture exactly the way I do, so there's no room for error or judgment. This behavior is often linked to a psychological trait called high conscientiousness. People with high conscientiousness tend to be meticulous, responsible, and sometimes perfectionistic. They care deeply about details, accuracy, and doing things correctly, and that extends to how they explain themselves. Over-explaining can be their way of covering every angle, leaving nothing ambiguous. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Neuroscience suggests that over-explaining can also be tied to a heightened sensitivity to social feedback. Our brains have a part called the anterior cingulate cortex, which is responsible for monitoring potential errors, conflicts, and social missteps. For some people, this part is like a finely tuned radar, constantly scanning for signs that something might go wrong in a conversation. Over-explaining is, in a way, a preemptive strike. By laying out every detail, the brain is reducing uncertainty and the chance of negative evaluation. Think about a time you were in a group discussion, maybe at work or school, and you hesitated to answer because you weren't 100% sure you had every fact right. Now imagine if your brain was saying, okay, I'll just explain a little more, give some context, anticipate objections, cover all angles. That's over-explaining in action, a strategy to prevent embarrassment, criticism, or being misunderstood. It's exhausting for the speaker, sure, but it's a coping mechanism that feels necessary in the moment. Interestingly, over-explaining is also tied to empathy, though in a way that can feel counterintuitive. You might think that someone who talks too much about a subject is self-centered, but often the opposite is true. People who over-explain are acutely aware that others may not understand or may misinterpret what they say. They're trying to bridge a cognitive gap, sometimes overcompensating because they care about clarity. The social motivation is, I want you to follow me. I want you to understand me fully, which, when done excessively, can look like a communication quirk or a nervous tic. There's also a cognitive dimension at play. Over-explainers often engage in internal rehearsal. They simulate potential conversations in their heads, anticipate questions, and rehearse their responses before they even speak. When the moment arrives, they end up verbalizing more than necessary because their mental script included every contingency. In other words, it's not random rambling, it's the brain's way of working out every possible angle before committing to a narrative. This tendency can be amplified by cultural and social expectations. Some people grow up in environments where precision and explanation were valued. Maybe a parent who always said, explain yourself fully, or a teacher who praised thoroughness. The brain internalizes this early messaging, associating over-explaining with competence, reliability, or social acceptance. And even as adults, the habit persists. Over-explaining becomes not just a strategy, but a deeply ingrained communication style. Now, let's talk about the emotional side, because there's almost always one. Over-explaining can be a manifestation of anxiety, particularly social anxiety or anticipatory anxiety. The mind constantly asks, will they get it? Will they judge me? Will I be misunderstood? Over-explaining temporarily quiets that anxiety. It creates the illusion of safety, like building a wall of words to shield yourself from critique. But here's a catch. It rarely actually reduces anxiety completely. That's why the behavior feels compulsive. Like even after you've said everything, there's this nagging feeling that it wasn't enough. Humor can be a helpful lens here. Have you ever listened to someone who over-explains and thought, wow, they're practically narrating the entire plotline of their life for a single sentence? That's because the brain is basically trying to make the world as comprehensible as possible. Imagine your inner dialogue as a tiny, overzealous librarian. Every fact must be cataloged, cross-referenced, indexed, and footnoted before being released into the wild. And if you're prone to this, the librarian never rests. That's a lot of mental horsepower going into what seems like a simple, I went to the store. But there's an upside. People who over-explain tend to be excellent communicators when their audience is receptive and patient. They provide context, anticipate questions, and often leave no stone unturned. In professional settings, this can translate to clarity, thoroughness, and reliability. In personal relationships, it can make them thoughtful partners and friends, people who genuinely try to ensure understanding, not just to be heard. That said, over-explaining can also have social consequences. People may misinterpret it as insecurity, indecision, or a need for attention. And because most social interactions favor brevity, over-explainers can feel misunderstood or judged for a behavior that is psychologically protective and well-intentioned. There's a constant balancing act between expressing themselves fully and not overwhelming others, a challenge that often goes unnoticed by anyone observing from the outside. One way to think about it is like pouring a glass of water. Some people naturally pour just enough to fill the glass, stopping at a satisfying level. Others instinctively keep pouring, worried that the first pour wasn't sufficient or that someone won't notice the fullness unless every drop is visible. Over-explainers are often the latter. The intention isn't to drown anyone, quite the opposite. It's a desire to ensure no one misses a drop of meaning. And here's where self-awareness becomes empowering. Understanding that over-explaining is rooted in conscientiousness, empathy, cognitive rehearsal, and anxiety allows someone to approach it with curiosity instead of self-criticism. You can ask yourself, am I over-explaining because I genuinely want to clarify, or because I'm anxious about judgment? Sometimes just recognizing the motivation can reduce the compulsion to over-explain, allowing communication to become more fluid and less exhausting. It's also helpful to remember that over-explaining is, at its core, a strength dressed in social awkwardness. The desire to be thorough, accurate, and comprehensible shows intellectual engagement and social awareness. The key is learning to modulate it, understanding when the audience truly needs every detail and when they just need the distilled version. In many ways, over-explainers are like cartographers of human thought. They want to map every nuance, every hill, every valley, so that anyone reading the map can navigate the terrain safely. Sometimes they just need to remember that not everyone requires a full topographical survey to find their way. A simplified map can still be profoundly useful. So if this made you think differently about yourself or someone you know, leave a comment about the quirks you've noticed in your own communication. And if you want to keep diving into the psychology of the mind, the little habits, the subtle behaviors, the things we think no one notices, stick around because there's always more to explore, and the human brain is endlessly fascinating.